Welcome to the GridMod Pod, brought to you by AEIC. In this podcast, you'll hear from the utility industry's top operations leaders on how their companies are working to modernize and improve our ever-evolving power grid. Thanks for joining us.
Hello, and welcome back to the GridMod Pod, the podcast where we dive deep into the world of grid modernization. I'm your host, Dr. Elizabeth Cook, and today I'm joined by a very special guest, and for this episode, a co-host, Brett Ryhal. So please introduce yourself, Brett.
Liz, thanks again for, we usually have some great talking points, so thanks for inviting me on. I'm Brett Ryhal from Electric Grid Infrastructure Services for Sargent Lundy. I'm one of their program managers. And I want to start off by thanking the AEIC. This is a really good opportunity for us to share a lot of lessons learned, where the industry is going, and just overall, it's a great organization that can really collab a lot of these great ideas and get them together under one roof. So this is a really good opportunity. I think you'll all enjoy some of these talking points. Hopefully we don't rabbit hole too much and dive off into too many strange subjects.
We do tend to rabbit hole.
We do. We chase rabbits. So,
however, this is one of my most exciting topics that I've convinced Brett that he should jump on here and ask me all the questions about planning, right?
Yeah. So we're gonna kind of jump into a little bit of planning, and I think this is where most of the industry starts off, right, Liz? Like, it's not necessarily something that everybody's familiar with. So for those that are acquainted, this is probably going to be redundant, but for those that aren't, hopefully this leads you down the right direction. So to kind of kick that off, so Liz, when we're looking at electrification, and especially when we're looking at edge of grid, battery energy storage, EV, what are some of the challenges to grid planning, specifically the planning side, to accommodate some of these load increases that we're going to see?
Just for some of our listeners, my background, almost 20 years in the industry, really has started from the essence of gathering the data to build the models to run the studies. And really the last 15 years has been in the realm of planning. My first love, which I love to say, is transmission. But over the last 7 years, I've really dived in deep in regards to everything that's happening on the distribution grid. So this is a topic that we could spend a large amount of time on. But what I think is happening rapidly is our industry, over the last 100 years, fundamentally did not need to have the full situational awareness of the distribution grid. And so we are rapidly coming to a place where we need to gather the data to build the models so that we can really baseline our current infrastructure, our assets where the electricity flows on. So, one of, I think, the biggest challenges is that visibility, right? So building the models, and to build the models, you have to have the data. But after that, it really then becomes a very multi-layered problem, and there's many solutions. So it becomes more of an art than a science. So it's hard to define the exact set of roles as we are really transforming and planning the ultimate infrastructure that needs to be here for the new age technologies while serving the current reality. So, I would say understanding and really believing in the forecast for what our customers plan on doing, as well as what they're currently doing, and just understanding from a customer and industrial perspective, because those are typically very large loads. But then also our residential customers are becoming very dynamic. So having the awareness and the capabilities to build the models to really replicate really this changing behavior. So where I'm kind of thinking is the term integrated planning. If you think about where we were, just to level set our listeners and you, is we looked at our circuits, each individually as its own, and we would scale a certain type of load growth, and we would ensure that the wires and the transformers and all the associated equipment in between is rated to handle that type of very static load. Where we're headed is that circuit is becoming very dynamic in how it uses the energy. Therefore, not only is it pulling the electrons off the grid. It's actually injecting electrons. So we talk about it a lot. We're going from one-way power flow to two-way power flow. And so when that starts happening, we really have to start thinking about the customer and doing kind of a bottoms-up approach to planning. So it's a complete 180 and going from a top-down to a bottoms-up. And that starts at the customer, at the community, and then we scale up at the county, at the state, and really start tying your distribution grid to the transmission, and it gets a little bit more complicated. But it's really driving that awareness that everything is changing and the rule book is being written as we work and evolve through this new reality. So
yeah, and you see the dynamic, you see the planning aspect a lot of times from the transmission. You mentioned transmission being one of the first departments and sectors that you worked in. And a lot of times in planning transmission, because they are so expensive, we spend a lot of time, like you said, looking at the data, looking at the peak power management, the age of the facilities. And it sounds like we have to take a similar mindset now and start using that on the distribution side. So integrations of renewables, whether those are batteries, solar in a lot of cases. A lot of customers have solar.
mm-hmm.
We have that other, you said it's multi-layered, right? You have the aging infrastructure that you mentioned. How do we account for that? And then you have the peak demand management. So what has your experience been with on the distribution side focus for those kind of spokes in the wheel, those different facets of it?
So it's kind of, I think the first step is baselining and level setting not only the operators of the grid, and then therefore the planners, and then therefore those that execute on the grid. It's going to take a larger stakeholder engagement. So how do we discuss it, visualize it, and really drive that discussion in a very flexible but rigid perspective, because otherwise you're never going to get to an end goal. So you kind of listed it out. It's almost like a Venn diagram. You have your customer needs, which are changing. You have to understand how the DER will be integrated and or then utilized. So one, allow it to connect to ensure for safety and operational effectiveness, but then how will it actually perform? And then you also have to ensure reliability is maintained, as well as we keep the eye on the ball. And then we throw in the word resiliency, which complicates what is resiliency and how do we bring that into the fold. And then, of course, doing this safely as well as efficiently. I would just, I would love to share and continue to share the messaging of how important it is to allow the group that is overseeing the grid holistically to start being able to have all of the tools in the toolbox to really enable and create conversation with many stakeholders to allow us to do things in a new way. And I think, one thing about the AEIC subcommittee that I'm the chair of in the DER, we really stay away from policy and regulatory engagement, and we stick to the fundamentals of technical feasibility and really lessons learned from certain engagements. And so the profound perspective is there has been a large amount of DER and changes in the grid in different parts of the world. And so there has been an evolution that we have seen the what, and really the why is really different state to state, country to country. But what is unique is the who, which is us, the people that are going to perform the studies, to drive the analyses, to get the insight, and really the how. So it's Ohm's law with very difficult layering of variables. All that to say is, at the core of that is, which is my other favorite topic, data, right? Data analytics. And so how are we communicating why data is such a powerful tool, not only for the utility to run the system planning analyses, but really taking that all the way to real-time operations, enabling new energy economies, and then giving that perspective to the customer, our commissioners, and all of the regulatory stakeholders in between, the reason, the aha, this is why. So I think the key is the story that we're telling, the reasons behind it, and getting really all the players on the same page and driving forward.
You mentioned
sounds pretty easy,
it
right?
sounds super
We can
simple
do
with an
this.
aging distribution infrastructure, right? So you did mention before I kick off
Right. I did mention that one.
the next question that I have for you. You mentioned DER. For those that don't know, that aren't acquainted with some of that lexicon for our industry.
Can I do? I'll do a shameless plug. First off, there's a whole season. It's called All
I
Things
had a
DER Podcast. There's 30
I had a feeling
episodes.
you're going to go there for.
So,
So watch all of those and then
but
pause the video, watch all
um,
those, then come back. Yeah.
right. But for all of you that want to know now, and really the triggering of the topic grid modernization, it is the preparatory work required to enable the existing infrastructure to allow distributed energy resources. And when we say allow, just from a physical, technical perspective, to do it safely, affordably, and reliably is, you know, solar or customer generation. So any generation at the edge that is injecting electrons, electric vehicle charging. So this rapid increasing load that we have not seen. You know, a lot of people like to compare it to AC. You know, there once was a grid before air conditioning. This is much more challenging, and the growth will be much more exponential. And then with vehicle to grid, there's a lot of talk around a lot vehicle, you know, electric vehicles is vehicle to grid. How the infrastructure of these batteries can then play a role in the grid's performance. So that's vehicle to grid, or some call it vehicle to X, which is pretty much everything. But one topic maybe you and I can join each other for another discussion is what are batteries and how can they be used as a distribution asset?
I think
That's another plug
I
for a
think we're
future
going to get on
episode.
that topic here eventually.
uh, and then we can't forget about efficiency programs, really creating the infrastructure, the measurement, and the tools for our customers where we can create really granular energy efficiency and demand response programs that really get down to pockets of the distribution grid to offset or defer, you know, capital spend or O&M based on reducing the usage of those assets. And so if we can start planning the grid in these smaller pockets and enabling our customers to use energy differently, which is using it at different times and or using it less, we can really, as a society, create this robust grid together. So DER is really all of those buckets, and we'd like to throw them all together to really say grid edge technologies, new ways to interact with our energy at the
Yes, and
edge.
you have
So
this.
thanks for allowing
Yeah,
me to define
you have
DER.
this aging infrastructure, right, on the distribution side. You know, 50s, 60s, 70s, some of these are installed, and there's this big gap between how do we go from these sun-weathered poles that we're just trying to maintain to keep peak demand, conductors managing or conductors supporting peak demand. How can we shift that to this more intelligent model, very similar, if not even more data driven than the transmission side? So you have, things like you've mentioned before in some of our conversations. We have to be able to have load forecasting on distribution. We mentioned resiliency, right?
Another
Another
episode.
episode, yeah. And then that
Yeah.
also, it's not always, as you and I have discussed before, it's not always to just have the data so we can forecast the load, so we can turn things on and off as necessary. But a lot of it does come down to be able to even support the utility side, which is predictive maintenance. We've talked about this before, and you know, some of these dynamic loads, how can we build out for future load growth, predicting that? So in data, let's kind of shift to data, because that's a very, once again, like it's a very broad topic. On the data
Right.
analytics and modeling, you know, how can we use that to predict electrification? How can we use it to optimize the grid in a manner that's going to support DER in the future?
Another topic that I love to dive into. And so I think, something that's happening in the industry right now, lots of talk about data analytics, data as a strategy, what is our cloud philosophy, in regards to cybersecurity, and then artificial intelligence. And so I think we have to be very careful as an industry as we use these terminologies but it's very similar to watching what has happened in all the other new technologies, is those that do not understand just start to distort or create realities that don't exist. So from, artificial intelligence is taking large, massive amount of data. And so when you think about data analytics, is you're studying those data looking for patterns or reoccurring events or behaviors. And then when you start layering various data sets on top of each other, it starts to, show new perspectives that really one wouldn't think of, or, may bring an aha moment. So it's very powerful in itself. And that's using like historical data and studying events. Once you take that knowledge and that awareness and you start creating beautiful mathematical relationships between all of what you're studying, and I'm being very vague on purpose because one thing I've learned from my studies is I was like, I want to get it to point B, and I have subset A1, A2, A3, and by the time I'm done, I learned something about C and D that I didn't even project or hypothesize about. And then I can take the learnings of C and D and start a whole other realm. But so you take those understandings, develop those algorithms, and then you start feeding it more data more rapidly, and it starts to teach and educate by creating a continuous effort of developing robust algorithms. So there's degenerative, there's generative, and there's all these different terminologies in regards to what is artificial intelligence. For the grid perspective, and it's what we were talking about, the key for a lot of us, especially those that haven't seen the proliferation of DER, is to baseline the current performance of the assets that we currently own and are regulated and required to operate and maintain. So understanding the overall health, the overall capacity, the overall optimal performance from new insights that we just didn't have the capability to tap into because we didn't have the models and the analytics and the computational power to do so. We can make broad brush assumptions. We can make very conservative, defined, methodologies to ensure we create a safe, robust grid. But now we're getting into this granular awareness that will trigger us to think differently. And so when I say think differently, it's think about, we have an asset, which is the grid, that we all individually own parts of. Every grid is, I like to say, a fingerprint. It's unique in itself. And every circuit within that grid that's maintained by said entity is also unique. So if we can tap into the analytics to really start to study and understand the performance, and when I say that, it's really the health of the current assets, the capacity of what it handles now and can handle, and then really like the past reliability, understand what caused that reliability. We can then prioritize how we plan the capital and O&M for future years to come, because you're always going to have to continuously maintain it because it's a physical asset. And without that baselining, we will have a very hard time to get ahead of how to enable DER. And so it's in our best interest to gravitate towards using the data to drive situational awareness of fundamental needs of today, which is asset health performance and system planning capacity. Those are things that we've been doing forever. And then using all the analytics in regards to studying our customer segmentation, in regards to EV adoption, in regards to solar proliferation, in regards to like customers that would be even engaged or willing to participate in a customer program. And, like how you've probably gotten the memos from your utility, like, hey, would you participate in this program? Like that's a whole new world for us, is how to get customers to be more engaged with the grid. So then you're on the next tier of data analytics and trying to drive change and understanding of how to use the energy service.
I think
I answered a lot of your
you did.
questions there. But the key is like data really will drive insights we've never had before to allow us to prepare for
and
this
data
new
is
reality.
really
And there's a lot of use cases of it happening.
Data in itself,
Sorry.
there is such thing as too much data, right? And that's the beauty of when we start talking about AI. And I think you mentioned AI is not necessarily Terminator, where the rise of the machines are going to happen. They are still advanced algorithms, and they do learn, and they can They can build on themselves. However, it is a way for us to handle large amounts of data so that we can consume it in a palatable manner and digest it in a way that's efficient and effective. As you've mentioned, we have to kind of be careful with the way we speak about it as AI is going to run this utility grid. Well, no, it's not. It's not really what's happening. We now have all of these points on the DER system, the DER system, that we're receiving this massive gigabytes, terabytes in some cases of information. That information is useless unless we have a way to manage it properly so we can get the insight that we want out of it. And that'll lead to, as we've seen in distribution planning, that'll lead to efficiencies and cost savings when you're planning the grid. Well, back in the day, it would be, oh, okay, we have a 600 amp circuit. We're anticipating a 20% load growth over the next 10 years. So when we rebuild it, we're gonna build it to 720 amps, and that's the end of the discussion, and we're done. How many times has that happened?
Right. And I guess I would
Go
love to
ahead.
interject on that. Right. And I think a lot of historical perspective of what a utility does is still ingrained in a lot of our stakeholder engagement. And so, like, the viability and really the feasibility to literally upgrade and enhance and make everything bigger and larger is very challenging. And we're talking 3, 5, 7 year timeframes for some very large projects, right? Like transmission, 3, 5, 7, 10 years, if ever. No, I'm just kidding. But it's really hard to build transmission. For the distribution grid, it's the same thing. We've already built the grid out to a large part of already developed communities and engagement. To upgrade and create complete redundancy is very long term in regards to distribution planning. We're talking 18 months, 2, 3, 5 years. And we're talking about customers that invest, build their building, and want power. So we need to not have those tools. We need different tools. And those different tools are DER enablement tools. So that's, I think, a big part of this discussion too, is our old ways of doing things are no longer actually feasible or available in a rapid succession because we've already built out. So now it's more about how do we reinvest in the grid knowing this new reality. And so I think utilities all understand that and want to show up differently. It's just getting past that idea that that's what we're doing. And it's kind of a catch-22 because we're showing and proving out new ways of doing things. It's very hard to really spell what is the benefit from a financial or customer, where nobody's asking what is the benefit of a larger transformer and what is the financial implications, because that's just always something we've done. But I think it's a great question.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot more value in some of these other solutions than just that upgrade the service and make everything larger.
It's definitely taking a proactive approach versus a reactive. We have a new apartment that's going online. We need 2 MVA. We're just going to install a transformer. We're already behind the 8 ball versus being able to predict when that is going to go into place using good customer outreach, being more integrated with the customers, and being able to predict it in a manner that is cost effective. You can actually have very cost effective savings that get baked into it. On that note, though, have you seen any of these integrations or these DER solutions so far? Good stories about them or good applications that have been nice success stories?
Yes. So, and I think, throughout this season, we're going to try to work in some of these utilities, but, what we're talking about is integrated distribution planning. And so that is the effect of how will the grid perform under all of these various new technologies, and how do we reduce the interconnection request timeline, right? How do we enable hosting capacity analyses? How do we look for these non-wire solutions, which is the term that we were just kind of talking about? Instead of the robust build big, it's non-wire solutions. There are 22 states that currently have these processes underway. So there's quite a bit of this work happening. And when you go through the various states and utilities that are performing it, it's at all different maturity levels of DER proliferation. There's a lot of work going into the baselining in some states, realizing that, for instance, California, who's been enabling and interconnecting, I think it's up to like 16 gigawatts of customer generation, unmanaged. And so when the East, per se, utilities or utilities that have not gone to that level, we're learning from those lessons. So yes, the grid is still performing. Are there various issues that are popping up? Yes. Can we effectively plan ahead so that we're prepared for that kind of reality? And so one thing we've seen is that, we can connect, but can we sustain? And does it maintain affordable? And are we achieving the reliability goals? And so there's like a lot of other things that are kind of falling out of really allowing that type of unmanaged DER, which I think we can benefit from. There's a lot of states that are requiring this based on mandates to enable certain technologies. But I will say, and I'm not quick to naming anyone, but there has been a couple use cases where there's no proliferation of DER, but they've shown by embarking on this new way and embracing data and the technology, they've driven down O&M, they increased reliability across the board, and they effectively are, planning to their customers' needs. It's that whole bottoms up. So I think it's a really exciting area, and I look forward to continue to kind of throw my quips in here on these episodes. But integrated distribution planning is a very vast topic. However, it's I think it's important that we start talking about it and continue to talk about it. So thank you, Brett, for that opportunity today, and I look forward to our continued
same here, Liz.
discussion.
So thanks again for having me on. And as everybody can tell, we can probably talk about this for hours on single subjects. So thanks for having me on. If you have any questions or you have a question that you want us to address, feel free to leave a comment. We would love to hear back, get some feedback, and dig into some of the items that you'd like to hear us talk about. So, Liz, thanks for having me, and look forward to talking to you next time.
That's a wrap for this week's episode of the GridMod Pod. Thanks for tuning in. We hope today's conversation got you thinking about new and creative ways to improve our power grid. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel to be the first to hear new episodes. This podcast is brought to you by AEIC, the place where operations leaders come together to share knowledge and provide guidance to the electric utility industry. We'll be back with a new episode soon. Until then, keep powering on.